Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. Thank you for joining us in where I am. It's a wet, wild, and windy day in Naarm, Melbourne. Thank you for joining us for this first webinar in the new Spotlight series that we've created on disinformation in disasters. My name's John Richardson. I'm the Executive Director at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and I'm really delighted to be a host for this important session. Really like to start before we go on to acknowledge that I'm hosting the event from the lands of the Wurundjeri people in the Kulin Nation, and also to acknowledge traditional custodians of all the various lands that you're joining from us today, and anyone, any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us in this event. I pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and also acknowledge the 65,000 years that the original systems thinkers, Indigenous peoples, have lived with natural hazards. And I think that there's much that we can learn from that accumulated wisdom as we face increasingly complex challenges. Before we get on, we always go through the the stuff we've got to do, which is the housekeeping. So I'll introduce Ika shortly, but a few things just to bear in mind of. Today's event will be recorded and made available along with the presentation slides after the event. So you can share it with friends, family, watch it on Saturday night with pizza if you feel like. We'll be using the Q&A function on Zoom. So please post your questions in Q&A and not in the chat. They can get lost in the chat window. So we'll be looking at the Q&A box. You'll be able to upvote the questions just by clicking the thumbs up, and I'll do my best to ask a number of these questions. We still encourage you to use the chat window because we get a lot of great sort of rich dialogue and commentary on there as well, and that's one great part of these webinars. So feel free to use the chat. Make sure you've selected everyone in the drop-down menu. I'd also, whilst you are using the chat or the questions, I'd like to remind you just to be respectful to each other and the presenters when you're commenting or asking questions. And lastly, some of the content that we discuss may be distressing or bring up prior experiences. So in that instance, please use any techniques that you've developed to help you manage any adverse reactions. So with the business out of the way, the world is becoming an increasingly more complex place with risks and consequences becoming systemic in nature. And our sector is rapidly evolving as we're exposed to these challenges. So to help practitioners, policymakers, researchers, that is you all, navigate these issues, we're excited to bring this new series. The series is a forum about conversations about emerging issues in disaster risk reduction and resilience, and to highlight topics of importance that may be emerging or may receive little attention or focus. The series is intended to support practitioners to be informed, build knowledge and skills, and identify sort of sound evidence when supporting planning and practice. To the topic that we're about to talk about, 5 years ago, well, over 5 years ago, I was on holiday and getting increasingly angry about misinformation that was being spread about my former employer who was managing appeal funds generated by the Black Summer bushfires. This stuff happens, and we know that over many years of managing appeals and things like that. But I think it was the speed and the vigor at which it spread that it astonished me. At the same time, there are also alternative narratives that were being developed about the cause of the fires, and these are sort of taking hold to suit sort of various agendas, including sort of political agendas. And this is where I start to get quite concerned about the ability to misrepresent knowledge, which in turn impacts on trust, which is a commodity of high value in our world in emergency management and disaster risk reduction. So it's something that's been certainly on my mind for a little while, and last year was at a presentation actually on maps, which was hosted by University of Melbourne, and came across the work of Ika Trijsburg, the Director of Urban Analytics for ANU Institute for Infrastructure in Society, and this was she launched the playbook on misinformation and disinformation for cities, and I thought this is somebody who's actually tackling it, and we've been in conversation since then, and really excited to introduce her now to share with you her knowledge about this sort of challenging issue that we currently face. So I'm going to get out of the way, Ika, and I'm going to let you take the floor and yeah, share what you've got with us.
Thanks, John. Thanks for that lovely introduction. And I'm really enjoying looking at the chat and everyone introducing yourselves. Whoever it was that introduced yourself as Big Rob, that is a fabulous introduction. But it's wonderful to see how many places around Australia and New Zealand you're zooming in from. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm also here in Naarm in Melbourne, and pay my respects to the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people and Aboriginal people who might be in this room with us, and other First Nations people as well, and particularly recognise the criticality of First Nations knowledge to the Academy, where I obviously have one of my hats, but also as a practitioner, and the way that we live in this land and other lands, and the way that we relate to each other and share knowledge with each other. So it's really exciting to talk to you about disinformation. I love talking about disinformation. I do it a lot. I lead a project across 5 Australian universities with a number of civil society partners called Disinformation in the City. And one of the things that is increasingly concerning is the way that disasters and weather events and crises are used as a moment when disinformation can flourish. When we already know that it's a key time when other spikes in other harmful behaviours happen around violence, around other forms of exploitation, but also in terms of disinformation, the way that uniquely impacts those crises and disaster environments. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of our work. I do use the term city a little bit, but often it's really about localised response. And so we're really drawing on that and pulling bridges into the context of disaster disinformation response. Can I have the next slide, please? So before we get into it, it's helpful to know what we're talking about. So disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, increasingly we hear these terms, perhaps in the media, perhaps in general life, but it's really important to understand what the distinction is. I'm using disinformation as largely a catch-all for the things that corrupt information integrity. What it technically means is false information that's deliberately created and shared with intent. So it differs from misinformation, which is false information that's shared, but the person who's sharing it might think that it's accurate. Disinformation, the person who is sharing it knows that it is inaccurate and is doing it with intent. And that's why it's a really, really key issue for us to address. And there are very particular drivers. So the 2 main drivers of disinformation are political, as you may imagine, and that's the side that many of us are a lot more familiar with, but also economic. There's significant money to be made in disinformation, whether that's through clickbait websites, whether that's through the increasing economic model around many news media, even traditional news media agencies that rely on clicks for advertising revenue. And so that can incentivize sensationalized content, but also the very rapid pace at which news needs to be created now can also mean that fact-checking doesn't happen as much as it did previously, or perhaps media outlets might like it to. And so misinformation and disinformation can blur in that space. But then there's also economic drivers from big businesses and a number of other entities. There's also foreign interference, which can take both economic and political frames. Next slide, please. So many of us might be familiar with sort of the fake news aspect of disinformation. Often when we start this conversation, the first thing that comes to mind is fake news about elections. And that's seen as kind of the key aspect that we need to address. And that's certainly something we need to look at. But fake news goes beyond, falsified accounts, whether it's on social media or in mainstream media. It also increasingly includes entirely falsified scientific reports that are presented to decision makers. We see that a lot in the climate disinformation space now. It can take all sorts of forms and can make it very, very difficult to undertake the legislative and moral requirements around evidence-informed and data-driven decision-making. And this has a key impact on policy making, but also on other organisations and their capacity to make the best decisions based on scientific knowledge. But it also includes things like deepfakes. So increasingly we see deepfakes, whether it's, we've got a representation here of former President of the US, Barack Obama, but we're seeing this at all levels of government. We're seeing it in journalism, we're seeing it around advocates, and in a number of different areas where deepfakes, whether they are artificial representations of someone's face, whether they are videos, or whether they are audio, are used to profoundly misrepresent a particular figure and drive distrust in that person and often in the institution that they represent. So, for example, there was the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, was targeted with a deepfake audio recording, which was obviously not an actual recording of him, purporting to say some inflammatory comments to incite grievance in a large population within Greater London, which was hugely damaging in terms of their trust and their ability to understand what was really happening with the Greater London Authority at that time. We're also seeing disinformation around key issues. So we're seeing measles outbreaks around the world now, which is related to anti-vaccine disinformation campaigns. This got to the extent in Samoa that the entire country needed to be shut down for 2 days to allow door-to-door vaccinations to be undertaken and debunking programs to be able to be rolled out. We've also seen conspiratorial campaigns such as the anti-15-minute cities campaign, which some of you may be very familiar with, which have promoted a really dystopian view or narrative of governance and of the institutions that serve our communities to drive distrust, which have led to really serious implications, both in terms of across communities, where there have been threats to policymakers and to others within communities, but also in terms of the sustainability initiatives that are often targeted, or in this case, 15-minute cities, which has a large sustainability component and livability component, being repealed and not being seen as politically salient. There's a number of different examples of how disinformation has marred unexpected events. We've got the image of the bridge in Philadelphia, sorry, not in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, that was hit by a container ship last year, a terrible accident in which a person lost their life, but which ended up also sparking a very significant anti-DEI disinformation campaign relating to targeting people in organisations across the city that were seen as diversity hires and not appropriately skilled for their jobs. So really significant implications at the individual level for people who are targeted, at the organizational level for organizations that have their functioning, their policy making, their service delivery highly impacted by disinformation, and by communities where different groups are more likely to, are more polarized, more likely to engage in incivil behaviors towards each other, and less able to have conversations around finding common ground and actually even having a common information footprint from which to begin those conversations. Next slide, please. So there's 5 main areas that disinformation in the local realm tends to, or thematic areas that it tends to follow. These are essentially social fault lines or societal fault lines. So the first, as you may anticipate following a pandemic, is health and well-being. So there remains a lot of disinformation in the health and well-being space. This is increasingly aligned with disinformation that's from some of these other pillars. There's now quite a robust and increasingly understood pipeline between a lot of disinformation in the well-being and wellness industry that is used as a pipeline or a threshold entry point for far-right extremist groups and white nationalist groups. In the gender and sexuality space, there's been a number of high-profile disinformation campaigns, particularly targeting trans populations and female leaders. And increasingly, we're seeing the impacts of this, as I said, not only at the individual level and at the community level, but also at the democratic level, as we see people turning away from elected roles or self-censoring in leadership in a variety of industries. Climate and sustainability, we've seen climate emergency declarations targeted and emissions reduction schemes, again, drawing on some of these other societal fault lines. So with disinformation, there's a few different aspects that we look at. So there's obviously the generation of disinformation and the political and the economic goals that I spoke about previously. And that's something that needs to be addressed. When we're looking at the impact level and we're looking at what we do at a local level, there's also understanding and responding to what makes people listen. So with these 5 pillars here, we're looking at the societal fault lines that are easily manipulated because people will listen, and it will actually, we want to. It makes us want to buy into the disinformation narrative. And so we see this with increasing frequency that regardless of the topic, and I gave the example in the previous slide of the bridge in Baltimore, that really quickly, because bridges are not really a societal fault line, infrastructure to some extent, but not really bridges. But that really quickly was manipulated into the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, which is an existing societal fault line, so that people would get on board and that it would be able to become a divisive and viral issue that was going to drive polarization, overwhelm, and disconnection and distrust. So similarly with emissions reductions initiatives in the UK, we've seen those take an anti-migrant frame as well. So again, skipping across these different areas. We've seen in Australia disinformation focused on First Nations, migrants, culture, and religion. We obviously saw the high level of disinformation associated with the Voice referendum, which was particularly disappointing because a report was actually done a year before the referendum was held by a UK think tank, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which outlined why the referendum was so prone to a significant disinformation campaign and what it would likely look like and what the impact would be. And that's basically how it played out. So this is where we can look at the fault lines that we have, the environmental context that give us really strong cues around anticipating disinformation. It is part of our information environment, but this is how we can have a really strong understanding of what sorts of narratives are likely to impact communities that we're working with, and particularly when it comes to crisis. And urban planning, we've seen conspiratorial narratives and very high-level campaigns that have swept the globe around 15-minute cities, smart cities, increasingly infrastructure, and a number of other things. And I'll, if we can have the next slide, I'll talk through what some of those lightning rod events are in a little bit more detail. So again, building on anticipatory space. And the reason why I'm starting with this before we get to the disasters is that so much of this can already be anticipated before a disaster. So we don't know necessarily where a weather event or a disaster is going to happen long in advance. But we do know what sorts of fault lines exist across different communities, and we can start preparing those communities to heal those fault lines and to be better able to make sense of information that they may be likely to encounter manipulating those fault lines. So really trying to bring as much as we can into the anticipatory space. We know that the key events that spark disinformation include elections, no surprises there, policy making, and again, policy making particularly around those thematic issues that I just outlined, but also around any other contested issue where there's a particular political gain in using disinformation or perceived gain or likely economic gain. It may well use those fault lines to drive engagement across the community. Events, both global and local, we've seen this in recent times around a number of conflicts that are happening in the world, but also things like major sporting events. You know, anything that's going to gain attention is a potential lightning rod for disinformation. Disasters and crises, as I've spoken about, and transitions. So anything that's novel, poorly understood, and new, where there's an opportunity for the narrative of distrust, particularly around surveillance, around ill health, to be pushed. Those are the things where it's really likely to spark disinformation campaigns. And the image here on the left, many of you might be familiar with, is of a 5G tower which has been burned. This was something that swept many countries around the world, related to a conspiracy theory that linked 5G towers with spreading COVID-19. This led to a lot of fear across the community, and people started to burn the towers down, to threaten engineers who were working on the towers, and a huge amount of distrust in the community that was the subject of a parliamentary inquiry, and a large-scale debunking effort and community engagement after the fact, which again speaks to the huge cost of not addressing disinformation or anticipating disinformation early. It can take a lot more work and a lot more money, and it can do a lot more damage if we're addressing it retrospectively. Next slide, please. So in disasters, we see all of this coming together in three different ways. So the first is disinformation about the existence or the severity or the cause of a weather event. So this is where we see things like conspiratorial narratives about cloud seeding. To use the example of Hurricanes Helene and Milton that hit the United States last year, the then Biden administration was accused of cloud seeding the hurricanes, and also were accused of falsifying the meteorological maps, and that there was no hurricane. Both of those were really damaging, and both of those also tied into climate disinformation around diminishing the impact that climate change has on severe weather events. The second area is disinformation around the disaster response. So again, to use those hurricanes as an example, the US government was accused of providing the aid only to Democrat voting areas or households within areas, which was false, and elicited a very strong reaction from people who felt that they were not receiving aid that they were that they should be because of the way that they were voting. But also there was a specific disinformation narrative about that accused the government of planning to seize people's land if they evacuated as they were advised, and that if people did that, the government would not allow them back onto that land. And these are the things that can cause people to put themselves in a very, very dangerous and harmful situation. We also saw foreign interference in those efforts, which was attributed by multiple outlets to Russian actors, which used the narrative that the money that was going to support Ukraine was money that should have actually been directed towards the efforts in hurricane response, and that it had been directly taken out of the funds that would otherwise have gone to these communities, which is not accurate. It's not the same funds. And the third area is that disaster disinformation exacerbates those fault lines. So just being entirely opportunistic about the fact that people are looking for information. They might be looking for information in different areas than they otherwise would. They might be more reliant on interpersonal information because of the crisis nature of the event, and also the heightened fears and uncertainty around that time. It is an opportune moment to then use disinformation that targets particular groups. Again, to use the example of Hurricanes Helene and Milton, there was a very strong anti-Semitic narrative that came into that, and a number of ways that the narratives around the disinformation narratives around the disaster were used against different groups within communities. And that has a huge impact, not only at the time, but also in terms of collective capabilities to work together in recovery, and also in terms of when we look at models of adaptive capacities across communities, it diminishes the links between groups, and it decreases multiple forms of capital within the community. Next slide, please. So this is the book that John mentioned that we published last year. And this is where we draw our learnings from that we then can apply across to guide response in this space. So as I said, it is focused on the city, but largely is around localized response. And we actually wrote this. There's a whole bunch of us who got to put our name on the cover, and I'd like to acknowledge the incredible contribution of my peers to that process and to guiding that process alongside me. But we actually worked with 40 people, as well as our group, around the world who brought expertise in city governance and leadership, but also different parts of academia, from cognitive psychology to machine learning and civil society, the tech sector, the media sector, and brought really different disciplinary views and forms of knowledge to apply to the challenge of how do we actually create something that is constructive, that is implementable at the local level, where so much of the impact is felt, where the risks can be higher because we're more politically malleable at the local level than we are at any other level of government. We have greater access to policy making, to services, to block those things from happening at the local level. And also we experience community at the local level. So when we see rifts occurring within the community, that's something we experience locally in our everyday life, much more than we obviously do when we're looking at national level initiatives. And that's why this is key to disasters and to emergency management, which has a key intersection with local government in most contexts, but also is profoundly localised in its impact. Next slide, please. So there's just a couple of things that I'll take you through. You can, I saw the link was put into the chat, so you can access the full playbook, and I welcome you to do so. It's actually been republished by a whole variety of different entities, including one that is specifically related to disaster resilience, but I apologise, I've forgotten the name of which organisation it was. But I'll just take you through two of the key framing areas that we articulated through that process and that we then base the rest of our work on. So the first is that when we look at disinformation in general, but also disinformation as it impacts emergency response and disasters and crises, is that we need to extend that continuum. And this is something that I think your sector does really well because it is highly connected and it recognises the long timelines around community resilience building, around adaptive capacities, and around how we operate in relation to crises and disasters. But bringing together all of the information that I started to articulate at the start there around the known societal fault lines, the known lightning rod events, but also understanding the trust and the way the different institutions that are trusted within communities. And that will differ across communities. And that's actually fine. So long as everyone trusts an institution that is trustworthy and that they're networked in and that they're sharing information so that accurate information can be received across the community, great. We don't want to have one source of truth. That's dangerous for any democracy. We want to have a networked approach of trusted institutions using trusted information that is accessible to people. Again, this differs across the community. Some people find academic information is the gold standard of information because of the ethics process, because of the peer review process, all those sorts of things. Some people find that profoundly elitist and inaccessible. So making sure that we have evidence-based knowledge that is presented in ways that is legitimate to different parts of the community and understandable to different parts of the community and in line with how they want to receive their information. And making sure that it's delivered by trusted people. Different people trust different people in communities. Making sure that the people with influence are actually networked into response. Again, this is something that you already do to a large extent in emergency management and disaster response. Making sure that there's a specific information and disinformation aspect to that work is really critical for being able to have the framework and the foundations that any effective disinformation response can be launched from in the event of a crisis and the subsequent disinformation that impacts communities. And also recognising that different places are trusted by different communities and building that into the model. We like to talk about the role of libraries. Libraries remain one of the most trusted places by a broad cross-section of the community, but not all of the community. There are people who still would feel that that's more left-leaning, for example, than their political views. And there are others who might feel that that libraries are not somewhere where they feel particularly welcome or that they have other accessibility issues. So really understanding what the risk profile looks like for disinformation and those fault lines, and also what the trust profile looks like, building all of that in anticipation of an event. Then when we do have disinformation that impacts a community, or we have a weather event or a disaster that occurs, getting out really quickly with pre-bunking So this is about activating those relationships, that trust network, and giving people access to information that will help them make sense of things that they might encounter. So recognizing that there's a likelihood that disinformation will follow particular lines, and so helping people have the tools to make sense of that. There's also a broader piece of community education in there that's really critical. We've seen some recent moves in Australia around embedding critical literacy and civic literacy in the curriculum for school-aged children, but the majority of the population is not school-aged. And we also need to be making sure that we are having multiple opportunities for people to build their understanding of the way that information is currently used, manipulated, whether it's by algorithms or generative AI, and what that means, and ways that we can each be empowered to make informed decisions before we share information, for example, or before we act on things. And then debunking and recovery. So extending the continuum out. And again, this is something that your sector does particularly well. After the fact, making sure that people have information to help them understand and make sense, again, of information that they have encountered, events that have happened. There's a very simple model that we like to use in this, which I call the truth sandwich, which is basically, always lead with the truth, then state the fallacy. So state the inaccurate information that you know is out there, the disinformation, why that's a problem, and use sticky facts, like make it compelling, not just a problem because, it's an issue for an institution that people in the community might not feel any particular affinity with. Make sure that people understand the reason why that impacts them and why that is a really significant issue that disinformation has circulated, and then end with the truth again. So you're always repeating the truth first and last. It's the most repeated. Then you're also actually engaging with the disinformation and stating why that is so harmful. We can't assume that across the community that there is broad understanding either of disinformation or that disinformation is necessarily a bad thing. There are people who see disinformation as simply the modern environment that we live in and the modern communication, and don't recognise the manipulative aspects of this particular form of information corruption. And then there's rebuilding and helping the community to recover from the event. There's often multiple groups that have been impacted, multiple groups that might need particular support to help them to understand disinformation that they might have been encouraged to buy into, to help them to see other alternative narratives, but also building resilience. Because if we don't invest in this, then the community is left at a heightened state where disinformation is then easier to take hold in the next crisis or emergency or lightning rod event. And so really making sure that we're then investing in the community's sense-making recovery process and helping them to de-escalate so that they're actually better prepared for the next event and not worse prepared. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through all of these. This is from the playbook, but these are just some examples of different techniques that can be used. And we've placed them very generally along that continuum. So looking at the before, during, and after phases, and some of the things that can be really effective. And there are some things, so for example, humour. Humour can be super engaging in helping get a particular narrative out, in disarming tensions, in starting to open a conversation that needs to be had with community. And so that can be great in that anticipatory or preemption space. During a crisis or after a crisis, humour is not appropriate. So that's not a time when that's going to be effective. And I know that's a relatively obvious example and that you're probably already well aware of that. But just visually representing when some of these techniques are particularly helpful. And like I said, the sticky facts and counter information can be really helpful in that debunking and recovery phase in particular. But there's a number of different things that we need to do throughout that entire continuum. And once again, I encourage you to look at the playbook if you are interested in having more detailed guidance around this, and also examples of different cities and organisations that have implemented this in their context. Next slide, please. And the other thing that I want to just draw your attention to, and again, City is in the middle of this. This could equally be any local authority that is responsible for collective response to a particular crisis. This is the model of who needs to be involved and some of the particular roles that each of these different collaborations has in disinformation response. So the first is multi-level. This is something that, again, in your sector is a particular strength given the high level of interaction between particularly national, state and local governments, and building on the key strengths of each, but recognising also that we need to build the disinformation channels and the disinformation response channels into that multi-level response that you have to emergency management, because it's different actors and it's different departments. So making sure that there is clear, there's clear scaffolding for those working relationships to make that possible. And this is challenging when a lot of disinformation response, for example, at the national level, happens within a classified environment. And there are agencies that are able to work at the subnational level and agencies that are not able to do that. So really making sure that we have clear frameworks for being able to access information that's needed around disinformation response. Multi-city, I mean, this in the context of emergency management can be, multi-city, but can also be, within your sector, making sure that there are those domestic networks and also international networks that I know you're already highly active in, both in terms of being able to share and learn, but also really importantly for the potential for innovation and providing a collective heat shield for each other. One of the things that disinformation does is it creates increased incivility and hostility and harassment of leaders, and creates a polarized environment in which it becomes really challenging for any institution to stick their neck out and try something new and to innovate. So it actually has a chilling effect on innovation. Whereas when we're looking at complex crises, we're looking at how we help communities and institutions that serve them to face the challenges that we are going to see into the future in a changing climate and also in a changed information environment. We need to have innovation. And so being able to create a collective heat shield where it's not one organisation or one entity that's going out and say, okay, we're going to try something new. We think it's going to work. We don't know yet. Actually saying, yeah, we're all going to support innovation in this space. We support each other to innovate in this space. It's very, very important in terms of the political salience and the willingness for organisations and institutions to take that risk. And in terms of the multi-sector collaboration, there's the value of a brains trust. There's multiple sectors that are impacted by disinformation, but also multiple sectors that have really valuable knowledge about disinformation, whether it's about their capacity to address disinformation or whether it's because of the touch points that they have with communities. So the brains trust is very, very important in this. And there's also the importance of legitimacy. So one of the things that that stood out in the post-Southport riots last year in the UK was who had legitimacy to take local action that actually dampened riots. And one of the things that emerged in that, and this is this was only in a small number of cases, but we're looking at how broad this effect actually might have been, but reported in a small number of cases, was the role of publicans and of pub owners saying that they would ban people who participated in those riots. And the impact that had, the chilling impact that had on riots, which didn't take hold in those places. Because in those contexts, publicans have a huge amount of legitimacy, and being banned from your pub has a very real impact if you are someone who lives in that community. And the group that was most drawn to those riots were people on the right side and more to the extreme of politics, and men. So again, looking at who has legitimacy within communities and how we bring that all together in terms of disinformation response in the context of a critical incident or a disaster or emergency management. Next slide, please. So this is I know it was in the chat, but this is also the link to the Disinformation and the City Response Playbook for anyone who is interested. We do also deliver a micro-credential on recognising and managing disinformation in partnership with the University of Melbourne, with the Hunt Lab for Intelligence and National Security. And that's something that we've adapted from what they've really successfully delivered and worked on with the national intelligence community for many years. And last year, for the first time, we actually adapted it to the local realm to actually look at, okay, well, how do we take all of that and make it something that's meaningful for the capacity of local actors, whether it's around local civil society, different authorities, or local government. So if you're interested in pursuing this area more, I encourage you to have a look at that. But if you're interested more generally in the work that we're doing, my email is there, and I welcome you to get in touch. I'd love to hear what's happening in your organisations and the communities that you work with.
Wow. Thanks, Ika. Again, what a tour through such a complex issue, and so seeing, like, when you start unpacking it all, seeing that all the different realms that this is playing out in, I think we kind of sort of think about it as, oh, this is just a social media thing, and it's just sort of people on their kind of Insta feeds or whatever, and kind of going, oh yeah, this is this. But when you actually sort of see how insidious it is, across kind of a whole range of societal matters and issues, and I suppose then also sort of thinking about, we often in emergency management, disaster management, are thinking in a kind of fairly linear way. We have we have a hazard, it has an impact, and then there's a consequence. But as we are sort of increasingly more sort of understanding, the systemic nature of risk and context in which perhaps those natural hazard events actually sort of do occur, then you start to sort of see how the boundaries, I think, get blurred, and that, I took away, like, thinking about the fault lines of society and being able to tap into those, and and ultimately, like, I mean, I suppose like every area of sort of civil society and sort of public policy, I mean, trust is critical in what we do. If we think about we know that trust is important for warnings and messaging, and so if we start to kind of lose trust, then that is certainly challenging and sort of problematic for us. So I know one of the questions in here is around sort of not it just being a kind of an information issue or freedom of speech, but it's also around, could this potentially have more serious consequences in terms of life and safety and the like. So I think, there's a lot that I certainly took away from that to kind of apply within the area that we work. So we've got quite a few questions. Hopefully we can get through them. So yeah, between us, I reckon we'll give it a go. One I'm going to sort of tackle, it's actually two. I'm going to combine it into one because of the yin and yang. So Sean has asked, like AI will likely turbocharge future disinformation, what's being done, and what can we do, if anything, to mitigate this threat? But then Michael poses the counter question, which I think is really also important and cool. So while AI is a potential turbocharger, could it also be part of the solution? Do we see a role for AI in combating misinformation? So yeah, what are your thoughts on that, Ika?
Yeah, both.
Yeah.
Basically, I mean, what we're seeing already with AI is that we have unprecedented capacity to create, for example, deepfakes, but also for bot-generated content to flood social media. It becomes very, very difficult to know what's real. You can have 1,000 social media accounts reporting a particular crisis in a particular place, none of which are true. And they can be varied enough using large language models to very rapidly look very different from each other as well. So all those sorts of things could cause us to provide, and this has happened in a number of places, to provide an emergency response where it's actually entirely not needed. And so then we have the kind of the boy who cried wolf situation where we actually, it becomes very difficult, not just for the community to trust authorities, but also for authorities to trust what's coming from the community. And so that becomes really, really tricky in terms of the having the ability to get rapid information from both ways, and then laterally as well across communities. There are some ways that AI is used to assist with identifying, in particular, harmful narratives that are starting to circulate, to be able to put in place some responses to those as well. But we do have a real lag in terms of institutional expertise around using AI, and particularly transparency of use of AI. And it remains something that's really untrusted across the community. And that's not, I think that there's some good reasons to be untrusting of the way that AI is currently used, because we don't have algorithmic clarity. We don't have clarity around a lot of what's happening, given that a lot of AI production is coming from the private sector that is not beholden to the same need to operate in the public interest that government and government entities are. And so there are some very significant risks there that we need to address. We're very fortunate we have the e-Safety Commissioner in Australia and a number of other entities, but there are some very significant governance risks and organisational risks around AI and transparency and trust that we need to identify and respond to very swiftly.
Yeah, and picking up on that trust question, and I see Chris's comment in the chat around a great presentation that Mark Duckworth did last week at Natural Hazards Research Forum, and I think this is in a couple of the questions. So thinking about breakdown of trust, and we hear about that. The Edelman Trust Barometer, says that we're going down and that we're in the era of grievance. What are the, I suppose, what are the simple things that people can do, people here can do, through to I suppose, well, we probably don't have time to answer all these, but let's start with what are the simple things that people can do to sort of help start to rebuild institutional trust?
The simple things to rebuild it. It feels like that's an oxymoron, but
yeah.
I mean, trust. There's a lot of things that erode trust. The things that build trust are transparency.
Mm.
So making sure that we are transparent around how decisions are made, what information has guided those decisions, who's been involved, being clear about who hasn't, and how we want to potentially involve other parts of communities or other voices in particular decisions. That has different levels of salience depending on the type of organisation you're in, and different legislative requirements, obviously. But also consistency. So making sure that there's actually a procedure in place that, again, is transparent, that is open, that can be pointed to, and that's consistently applied, and that actually identifies these sorts of things, whether it's around what's going to be classified as disinformation, who's going to decide that, how it's going to be decided, what's the matrix that's being used in the organisation, and then what's the matrix for deciding the response. So is this something that's going to be referred to police? You know, there are some things that an organisation doesn't need to deal with itself. What things are not going to be, like what's going to just be considered not worth responding to, or is going to be deleted? What's going to result in someone being deplatformed? You know, all those sorts of things is really important. And then competence. So making sure that we are, as organisations and institutions, keeping step with the different technological advancements and governance advancements, and making sure that we are continuing to build our capacities and demonstrating that to communities to address these challenges.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I'm just looking at a couple of the other questions before we close, but you know, Simon and I think Matt around, or what can agencies do? And I think, you know, being incorporating within information units and within planning for responses, you know, through incident management teams, this has to be something that the information units identify, and picking up on what you're saying, you know, build capability and capacity, and you know, perhaps the micro-credentialing course that you're talking about is a first step in being able to sort of help people in those units who, and we know that information is moving really sort of fast and changing rapidly. So certainly something that, you know, I think we should be built into sort of the planning for responses.
And it's been something that's been identified across the board. We're starting some work on this around sort of developing and piloting rapid response mechanisms that relate to disinformation that can be applied, you know, whether it's a disinformation event during a natural disaster, not a natural, an environmental disaster, or at another time, whether it's around policy making or a particular other event. One of the things that I think is a really interesting initiative to highlight that's come out of a few different sectors, and where and I think really shows us how the collective can be beneficial in this, is having allies in advance and actually coming to each other's aid. So when there's a particular agency that might be overwhelmed by disinformation, or even the target of disinformation, which can have the impact of really making things grind to a halt, whether it's around creating distrust around accessing aid from that or services from that organisation, or all sorts of things that can have a very, very devastating effect on the ability to serve communities at the time they need it, that other agencies actually will come in and support them, you know, through social media, through their own trusted mechanisms, to actually make sure that there's that collective response. And we've seen this, again, there's an example of shots heard around the world in the playbook, but at the municipal level as well. We've seen that in Italy, where that's been something that's been set up in advance and then can be implemented when there is a crisis. And I think those are the sorts of things where there's relatively inexpensive and relatively easy opportunities for us to do some significant things around addressing disinformation.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Look, that's all we have time for. I think we could talk about this for hours and hours, but we can't. We've got to get you back to your desks and your day job. So thank you, Ika. Hopefully please join me in thanking her for sharing, again, what was an extraordinary and informative session. I'd like to also give my thanks to the team here at Ada, Angela Draper, Charlotte Fell, and Simone Decker for their work in making this possible. And then I also just want to acknowledge the financial support of the National Emergency Management Agency in helping bring this this topic to you today. The next ADA webinar will be the Indigenous Disaster Resilience Research webinar. It'll be co-hosted by our Australian Journal of Emergency Management guest editors, Dr. Biami Williamson and Lucy Kaiser. And this webinar will feature presenters from the Indigenous edition of AGEM. I'll be running during NAIDOC week on the 9th of July. So the registration link is in the chat. So sign up for what's also going to be a fabulous session. When you leave, you'll be asked to take a short survey. If you please do that, this really helps us understand what you need. It's been my pleasure to host you this afternoon. So until next time, please stay well.